Okay, welcome back. So this lecture is going to be the final lecture of Unit 1, the lecture on drawing. But before I get to drawing, I just want to wrap up lecture number 3 for Unit 1, the lecture on mark making and gesture, because I was just about to make one last point about Glenn Brown, which is that um, in the beginning of his career, he made a lot of paintings based off of Frank Auerbach. And in Frank Auerbach's paintings, they're really kind of expressive and gestural and thick, right? Very impasto. The paint really kind of rises up from the surface, and he makes these marks over and over again. And in the Glenn Brown paintings, which are based off of them, the these gestural marks are unreal. They are fictional. They are super flat to the surface. He paints them as if they're really, really built up, but they are not built up at all. And so it's the illusion as if, and in some ways, the Glenn Browns look even more gestural and more goopy than Frank Auerbach's, but they aren't. They are super smooth, super flat. All right, let's talk about drawing. So we need to go to the next lecture and slideshow. Okay, so this lecture might be a three-parter. It's a little bit longer. We have a number of things to cover. Some of this will be kind of a recap of some of what we've already talked about in terms of line and gesture and mark making. Um, and um, some of it, but a lot of it will be also a discussion of what are the boundaries, what are the definition of what is a drawing. Before we maybe get even started on that, let's first talk about this idea of art medium. I prefer the term tradition or discipline because I think medium sometimes creates the impression that these categories are really, really tightly bound, right? That like people who draw just use these materials. But what the difference is between a drawing and a painting or a drawing and a print can sometimes be a little bit hard to tell. So I think tradition and discipline sum up a little bit better. There are these just continuous traditions of ways of using and thinking about tools and art making. Okay, so starting point is one of the reasons why we're talking about drawing as the first unit, because drawing is often considered the most fundamental art medium, but also because fundamentally what we're looking at when we're looking at cave paintings, like this image from the Wall of Lions from Chauvet Cave, fundamentally what we're looking at are drawings. They were they they may have had brushes, but we are not sure. They probably put pigment on in a number of ways, a lot just by direct application with their hands. But they certainly did a lot of work where they were using like burnt sticks to scrape marks, charcoal marks onto the wall. And that's, for I think most people, closer to the definition of drawing than it is to painting. So there are a couple of different ways that people define what is a drawing. One way to define what is a drawing is to say a drawing is fundamentally about line. Um, and that's a good definition. Another way is to say, to define it more in terms of materials, like drawings has to be fundamentally made on paper. I don't think that's a great definition because I can think of lots of drawings that are made on other surfaces other than paper. Some people would say that a drawing has to be made with a dry tool, but this drawing and is made with a pen, and there are lots of, and pen is not a dry tool; it uses a wet medium. So, um, so those are some of the definitions. Other definitions of a drawing has to be black and white. That works often, but not always. But let's get back to line. So line is generally considered a fundamental part of drawing, and that why one of the reasons why drawing is considered sort of like the fundamental starting medium, it's the medium that all other mediums come from, is because it's so tied to this fundamental unit, the line, and because figuring out an idea of, let's say, an idea for a sculpture or an idea for a painting, so frequently for many artists, that first has to begin in some form of a drawing. So let's talk a little bit about line quality. We've already talked about this a little bit. We talked about calligraphic marks in the last lecture, but Think about the line qualities that we're looking at here. These are all very tight, crisp lines, but there's a huge difference from this line to these lines or to these lines. And then there's a huge difference from that to these types of lines. One of the things I want everyone to know and really understand is the value of change of line weight, right? In all of these drawings, even on the previous page, we can see that the lines do not stay consistently the same weight. They vary in thickness and heaviness, but some are more controlled than others. Ellsworth Kelly's drawing has very little change of line weight, whereas these drawings here, especially the two on the left, especially this one by Rico Lebrun, has a huge change of line weight, right? Very dramatic calligraphic marks, which change from very thin lines to very thick lines. That's because it's drawn with a brush, right? Whereas this John Byrne drawing, which probably was drawn both with a pen and a brush, is more controlled, but there is still a lot of dramatic changes of line weight, very calligraphic mark. And here it's much more subtle. The change of line weight doesn't happen quite so obviously. Another thing to know about drawing in general is the idea of a cross-contour line. So one of the things we're going to be talking about in this early discussion about drawing is keep in mind we're considering the fundamental definitions of what is a drawing, but we're also kind of thinking about some of these fundamental activities such as a contour line drawing or a cross contour line drawing as these kind of starting points of all drawing. And a cross contour line drawing is any drawing where the artist imagines a line that runs over the surface, right? And this imaginary line helps to understand those kinds of changes, ripples. So you can really see it clearly in this student drawing where the student is really thinking about a line representing all the changes of surface on that apple. So, like I said before, one of the fundamental definitions of drawing for many people is that drawing is fundamentally about line. But we have lots of great examples of purely tonal drawing. Especially this Akins here is a purely tonal drawing. This Proudhon is actually, if you look at it up close, it's still made out of small little linear marks, little hatch marks. It feels very tonal, especially represented at this scale, but it is fundamentally a line drawing with a lot of tone. But many drawings have more tone than line. Line is not necessarily the only definition of a drawing. Another thing that's important in drawing, we've talked about gesturalness already, is the idea of gesture, right? Everyone who takes a drawing class has to do a lot of gesture drawings, and learning to be gestural, learning to be loose and expressive, learning to draw quickly. The reason why gesture drawing is so important in the beginning stages of learning to draw is it helps you to learn to see the whole, to see something and to see it quickly and coherently, like one whole sense, rather than to try to break things down into parts and try to draw one object at a time, but instead try to draw the whole mass of the things all together. And that helps like in trying to draw the whole gesture of the figure rather than trying to draw the hands and then the feet and then the legs. Because if you try to draw that way, everything just falls apart. So another thing that we've talked about is that many people in their definition of drawing has to be black and white. But then what do you do about pastel drawing? Is pastel drawing or is it a form of painting? There's many pastel artists debate this topic. But we're going to look at a number of examples of pastel drawing. And I think when it's artwork where you really feel and see the hand and where you see kind of like the underlying drawing as well as the layers of drawing on top, I still feel like it feels more like a drawing than a painting to me. But I think it's really kind of dependent on the way the artist thinks. Okay, we're going to end part 1 right there. All right, I'll see you when we get to part 2.